Driving has always been a part of my life. As a truck driver, I've spent countless nights on the road, often under a blanket of stars with nothing but the hum of my truck for company. It was a lonely profession, but one I had come to appreciate. The solitude gave me time to think, to reflect on life. Yet, not every journey is peaceful. Some nights, memories resurface that I'd rather leave buried. This is one of those memories. It happened a few years ago during a long haul to a remote town. The job was simple: deliver a shipment of construction materials to a site far from the main highways. After 3 grueling days of driving and unloading, I was ready to head home. My mind was fixed on the warmth of my house and the promise of rest. The road ahead was isolated, a long stretch of asphalt bordered by dense forests. The sky had turned a pale orange as the sun began to set. I checked my fuel gauge and realized I'd need to stop soon. Not long after, I spotted a small, weathered gas station in the distance. The place looked like it had been plucked from another era, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. As I pulled in, the gravel crunched under my tires, breaking the oppressive silence. A solitary figure emerged from the shadows, the gas station attendant, an older man with a weary look. "Long night ahead?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just need to top off and keep going." He nodded and started fueling the truck. As I waited, I felt a strange unease creeping in. The forest surrounding the station seemed too quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. "Word of advice," the man said, breaking my thoughts. "Don't linger too long out here. Strange things happen on these roads after dark." I laughed nervously, brushing off his comment as local superstition. "Thanks, but I'll be fine. Just need to get back home." He didn't respond, just gave me a look that lingered longer than necessary. Once the tank was full, I paid, thanked him, and drove off, eager to leave the eerie station behind. The sun dipped below the horizon as I merged back onto the road. The trees loomed taller, their branches twisting into ominous shapes. A cold chill ran through the cab, and I instinctively turned up the heat. I told myself it was just the fatigue playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew this drive was going to be anything but ordinary. The deeper I drove into the night, the more I felt the solitude closing in. The forest seemed endless, its shadows stretching across the road like grasping hands. The soft glow of my headlights barely pierced the darkness ahead, and my mind began to play tricks on me, catching glimpses of movement in the corner of my eyes. I tried to focus on the hum of the engine, a familiar sound that usually soothed me. But tonight, even that felt ominous. The road was unusually empty, not a single car passing me in either direction. It was as if the world outside my truck had vanished, leaving me alone in a void of black asphalt and dense trees. It was then that I noticed something in the distance, a faint glimmer of light in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was a reflection or maybe an animal crossing. As I got closer, I realized it was neither. There, standing in the middle of the road, was a figure. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. The truck came to a halt mere feet from the figure, and my heart pounded in my chest. The figure didn't move. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes that blended into the night. His face was obscured by the shadows, but the glow of his eyes, bright and unnatural, was unmistakable. For a moment, we were locked in a silent standoff, my headlights casting an eerie glow on his silhouette. Every instinct screamed at me to reverse, to turn the truck around and get as far away as possible. But I was frozen, unable to tear my gaze from those piercing eyes. Then, without warning, the man turned and walked into the forest, disappearing into the darkness. The moment he vanished, a cold dread swept over me. My instincts kicked in, and I floored the accelerator, desperate to put distance between me and whatever I had just seen. As the truck roared back to life, I glanced in my rear-view mirror. My blood ran cold. The man was there again, standing in the middle of the road, exactly where I had first seen him. I didn't stop this time. My foot pressed harder on the gas, and I drove as fast as the winding road allowed. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached, and my eyes darted between the road ahead and the mirrors, half expecting to see him again. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and I began to think I had escaped. But just as I allowed myself to breathe, the CB radio crackled to life. At first, it was static, a faint hiss that grew louder. Then, through the interference, came a voice, low, raspy, and unmistakably human. "You can't outrun what you don't understand." The radio went silent, leaving me with only the sound of my pounding heart and the hum of the engine. The voice on the radio echoed in my head, its cryptic warning embedding itself deep within my thoughts. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, the hum of the truck's engine now a weak solace against the rising tide of fear. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a prank, a random frequency picked up by the old CB radio. But the tone, the timing, the very words, they felt intentional, personal. The road stretched endlessly ahead, each curve and shadow amplifying the isolation. I kept glancing at the mirrors, half expecting to see the figure again. Every flicker of light or shifting shadow made my heart jump. The forest seemed alive, its towering trees leaning in as if to suffocate the road. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the truck and the relentless whisper of wind outside. I debated pulling over, taking a moment to gather myself, but the thought of stopping, of being still, felt unbearable. I needed to keep moving, to get out of this place. As I rounded a bend, I saw it, a faint glow in the distance. Relief surged through me. A gas station. Civilization. Safety. The closer I got, the more peculiar it seemed. The station was old, its neon sign flickering weakly. A single pump stood under a rusty canopy, and the small building beside it looked abandoned. Yet the light inside was on, casting a pale glow onto the cracked pavement. I pulled into the station, the tires crunching on gravel. Cutting the engine, I sat in silence for a moment, gathering the courage to step outside. My breath fogged the windshield as I exhaled slowly. Stepping out of the truck, the cold air bit at my skin. The night was unnervingly silent, the kind of quiet that felt wrong. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. I approached the pump, but something felt off. The numbers on the display blinked erratically, and the handle was smeared with something dark. Blood. No, it couldn't be. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Inside the building, a figure moved behind the counter. My relief was fleeting. The attendant, if that's what he was, stared at me with hollow eyes, his face gaunt and pale. He didn't speak as I entered, didn't even acknowledge me. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. "I need gas. And, is there a phone I can use?" He didn't respond. He just pointed to the pump outside, his bony finger trembling slightly. Then he spoke, his voice low and raspy, eerily similar to the one I'd heard on the CB radio. "You shouldn't be here." Before I could react, the lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When they came back on, he was gone. I stumbled back outside, my pulse racing. The pump, once flickering, now stood completely still, its screen blank. My truck sat under the canopy, but as I approached, I saw it. On the dusty windshield, written in long, jagged strokes, were two words: turn back. My heart pounded as I stared at the words on the windshield. Turn back. The handwriting, or whatever had made it, was uneven, almost claw-like, as if scratched by something not entirely human. Instinct kicked in. I scrambled back into the truck, locking the doors with trembling hands. The stillness outside felt alive, as if the night itself was watching me. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps it was the wind, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. The key turned in the ignition, and the engine roared to life, breaking the oppressive silence. I backed out of the gas station, the tires crunching loudly on the gravel. My headlights illuminated the deserted road, and I floored the accelerator. As the truck picked up speed, the forest on either side seemed to close in, the trees casting twisted shadows that danced eerily under the headlights. My focus wavered, my eyes darting to the mirrors, half expecting to see that haunting figure or the gas station attendant's lifeless stare. Minutes stretched into an eternity as I drove deeper into the night. Then, the CB radio crackled again. My breath hitched as the same voice, now more distorted and guttural, came through. You can't run forever. I yanked the cord, trying to shut it off, but the voice continued. You should have stayed. Now, it's too late. The road began to feel unfamiliar. Had I missed a turn? No, this was the only road out. Panic crept in as I noticed something strange. The mile markers seemed to repeat. First mile 112, then mile 112 again. Was I going in circles? I pulled over, the truck skidding slightly as I came to a stop. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white. The silence was deafening, save for my ragged breaths. Grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment, I stepped out. The cold air was sharper now, cutting through my jacket like knives. I shone the light down the road. The asphalt stretched endlessly, the darkness beyond my beam impenetrable. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like whispering. It wasn't coming from the trees, but from the truck. I turned slowly, the beam of the flashlight trembling in my hand. The cab was empty, just as I'd left it. But on the passenger seat, something was out of place. A photograph. I stepped closer, my stomach churning as I picked it up. It was a picture of the gas station I'd just left, but the image was distorted, the lights too bright and the shadows too deep. In the photo, my truck was parked under the canopy, and behind it, a figure stood. The same figure from the road. My chest tightened. I dropped the photo and jumped back into the truck. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, as if the night itself was closing in. The engine roared to life, and I sped off, not caring where I ended up. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, away from the whispers, away from whatever was following me. The road twisted and turned, each mile blending into the next. My headlights barely cut through the thickening fog that seemed to rise from nowhere. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again, a figure standing by the roadside. This time, it moved. It turned its head, those hollow eyes locking with mine, and raised a hand to point directly at me. I swerved, the truck veering dangerously close to the edge of the road. My tires skidded, and I fought to regain control. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The truck steadied, but my grip on the wheel was ironclad, sweat slicking my palms. The figure had vanished, but its image was seared into my mind. Those hollow, accusing eyes and the way it pointed, as if marking me for something inevitable. I floored the gas pedal, hoping speed would outrun whatever this was. The fog thickened, swallowing the road ahead, and my headlights barely pierced through. The world outside the cab felt distant, unreal, but the pounding of my heart was all too vivid. The CB radio crackled again. My breath hitched as the voice returned, warped and mocking. "Running won't save you. This road belongs to us." I slammed my fist into the radio, silencing it, but the damage was done. The words echoed in my head. Who was US? What did they mean? My stomach churned, fear gnawing at the edges of my sanity. A bend in the road forced me to slow down. I took the curve cautiously, but as I rounded it, the truck's headlights illuminated something that made my blood run cold. It was the gas station. The same gas station I had fled from not long ago. I hit the brakes, the tires skidding against the asphalt. The truck lurched to a stop, and I sat there, staring in disbelief. The neon sign flickered faintly, casting a sickly glow over the station. The pumps stood like sentinels in the fog, and the office window gleamed with an eerie light. No, this wasn't possible. I'd driven for miles. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of it. I'd taken no turns, no back roads. There was no way I could have looped back. It defied logic. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn around and keep driving. But something compelled me to step out of the truck. Maybe it was desperation for answers, or maybe it was sheer madness setting in. The cold air bit at my skin as I approached the gas station. Each step felt heavier than the last, the silence around me oppressive. The neon sign buzzed faintly, and the door to the office creaked as it swayed slightly in the breeze. I pushed it open cautiously. The interior was exactly as I remembered, dimly lit, cluttered with old maps and trinkets, and smelling faintly of gasoline. But the attendant was gone. I called out, my voice trembling. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Silence. The whispering started again. It wasn't coming from the radio this time. It was all around me, low and indistinct, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. My skin prickled as I turned toward the source, a door at the back of the office, slightly ajar. Every rational part of me screamed to leave, to get back in the truck and drive until the tank ran dry. But something drew me toward that door. My footsteps echoed as I approached, and the whispers grew louder. I pushed the door open slowly, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. A faint, flickering light emanated from below, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Against every instinct, I stepped onto the first creaking step. The air grew colder as I descended, the whispers now forming words I couldn't quite make out. The staircase seemed impossibly long, and when I finally reached the bottom, my breath caught in my throat. The room was small, its walls lined with photographs. Each one was of the same stretch of road, taken at different times of day, in different weather. But the truck in the photos was always the same. My truck. My knees nearly buckled as I backed away. A table in the center of the room held more photographs, and at the top of the pile was one that hadn't been there before. It was me, standing at the top of the stairs. Driving felt like an eternity, every shadow on the roadside morphing into a potential pursuer. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears, my hands gripping the steering wheel with enough force to turn my knuckles white. The road stretched on, shrouded in a darkness that seemed thicker than it should have been, broken only by the intermittent flicker of the truck's headlights. Suddenly, the CB radio crackled again, startling me so badly I almost swerved off the road. "Still out there, driver?" The voice was softer now, almost mocking. "Keep running. It makes the game more fun." My breath hitched as I reached for the volume knob and shut it off completely, but not before the voice chuckled one last time. Even with the radio silenced, it was as if I could still hear it, echoing in my mind. When I finally reached a well-lit truck stop, I pulled in with shaky hands, parked haphazardly, and stumbled out of the cab. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it did little to dispel the terror clinging to me. Other truckers were milling about, their casual demeanor a stark contrast to my frantic state. I approached one of them, an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes. Have you ever heard of a channel picking up strange voices?" I stammered. He paused, his expression darkening. "You're not the first to ask that. They say there's a rogue channel, something that doesn't belong to any CB network. Some call it a prank, others," he trailed off, his gaze distant. "Others think it's something else. Something out there, watching us." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the corner of the truck stop diner, nursing cup after cup of coffee, replaying the events in my mind. When dawn finally broke, I felt a sliver of relief. Whatever had happened, it couldn't follow me in the light of day. Could it? Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear that voice again. I haven't driven long hauls since that night. I stuck to local routes, safe, predictable, close to home. But every so often, when I'm parked and the night is still, I glance at my CB radio and feel the urge to turn it on, just to see. To prove to myself it was all in my head. I never do. Because deep down I know. Some roads carry more than just travelers. And some voices are meant never to be answered. Being a truck driver has always been more than a job for me. It's been a way of life. The hum of the engine, the stretch of endless highways, and the solitude of the open road gave me a sense of purpose and peace. My days were long, often monotonous, but they allowed me time to think, to reflect on life. Yet, there are moments that remind me why I rarely speak of my time on the road. Moments like the one I'm about to recount, a night I wish I could erase from my memory. This particular trip happened several years ago. I'd been assigned a late-night delivery, a route I'd never driven before. It was supposed to be straightforward: pick up the goods, drive through a remote stretch of highway, and deliver the load to a warehouse in the next state. I remember leaving the pickup point as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting fiery streaks of orange and red across the sky. By the time I hit the desolate highway, darkness had swallowed the world whole. I'd been driving for hours when the unease began to settle in. At first, I brushed it off as simple fatigue. The road was eerily empty, just me and the occasional silhouette of deer darting across the asphalt. The trees on either side of the highway loomed like silent watchers, their twisted branches stretching toward the heavens. As I continued driving, I realized how isolated this stretch of road truly was. No streetlights, no other vehicles, just the beam of my headlights carving a path through the oppressive darkness. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on you, made you hyper-aware of every sound, every creak of the truck, every whisper of the wind. Then, the first oddity occurred. A faint noise, barely perceptible, came from behind me, as though something shifted in the cargo. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the back was pitch black. Probably just the load settling, I muttered to myself, though the explanation did little to calm my nerves. The silence outside grew heavier, almost suffocating. Even the rhythmic hum of the engine felt distant, as if the truck was moving through a void rather than along solid ground. I shook my head, trying to focus on the road, but that nagging feeling of being watched crept into my mind. I told myself I'd been on edge for too long. It wasn't unusual for long hauls to mess with your head. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just exhaustion. Something about that road, that night, felt wrong. I pressed on, gripping the steering wheel tighter, convincing myself that I just needed to reach the next rest stop. I had seen it on my map earlier. a small gas station about 20 miles up the road. A quick break, a cup of coffee, and I'd be good to finish the haul. But as I drove, the unease in my chest refused to subside. Every shadow outside seemed to shift unnaturally, and the air inside the cab felt heavier with every mile. The faint noise from the cargo area came again, a soft, almost rhythmic thump. It wasn't the kind of sound that should come from the cargo shifting, though. It was too deliberate, too alive. I told myself to ignore it, to focus on the road, but I couldn't help glancing in the rear-view mirror again. The darkness behind me felt denser than before, almost as if it was watching me back. I turned the radio on to drown out the silence. Static hissed through the speakers, and I realized there were no stations within reach. Frustrated, I shut it off. The quiet settled in again, heavier this time. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the wheel, willing myself to concentrate. The GPS on my dashboard flickered briefly before going completely black. "Great," I muttered, smacking it with my hand, but it remained dead. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the side of the road, illuminated briefly by my headlights. It was too fast for me to make out details, but I was sure I'd seen someone. They didn't wave for help, didn't move at all, just stood there, motionless. My stomach churned as the image of that lone figure burned into my mind. Just a hitchhiker, I thought, though my voice didn't sound convincing even to myself. But why would anyone be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this time of night? I glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping to see the figure recede into the distance, but there was nothing. The road behind me was empty again, swallowed by the dark. A loud thud jolted me back to reality. A heavy sound coming from the cargo area, as if something had slammed against the wall. My heart raced. I pulled over to the side of the road, the tires crunching against the gravel. I turned the engine off, and silence enveloped me again. I stepped out of the cab reluctantly, the cold night air biting at my skin. The darkness outside felt alive, the kind that seemed to press in from all sides. The cargo door loomed ahead of me like a black void, and I hesitated, gripping the flashlight from the glove compartment. My footsteps felt deafening against the stillness as I approached the back of the truck. Probably just the load shifting, I whispered to myself again, though I knew better. With a deep breath, I unlatched the door and swung it open. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness inside, revealing nothing. The cargo was exactly as it should have been, securely strapped and undisturbed. I closed the door quickly, my hands trembling. Climbing back into the cab, I locked the doors instinctively. As I turned the key in the ignition, the truck sputtered before roaring back to life. That's when I saw it again, in the rear-view mirror. The same figure, standing in the middle of the road, directly behind my truck. Its face was obscured in shadow, but its presence sent a wave of icy dread through me. My instincts screamed at me to drive. And that's exactly what I did. The tires screeched as I slammed my foot on the gas, the engine roaring as the truck lurched forward. My hands were trembling, gripping the wheel as though it was the only tether I had to reality. I refused to look in the mirrors again, afraid of what I might see. The road stretched endlessly ahead, dark and desolate, the faint glow of my headlights barely piercing the suffocating blackness. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and my pulse pounded in my ears. As the truck sped down the empty highway, the rhythmic thudding from the cargo area returned. This time, it was louder and more deliberate, as if something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. "No," I muttered under my breath, shaking my head. "It's nothing. It's just the road. It's just the truck." But the thudding didn't stop. It grew more erratic, echoing in the confined space of the cab. Panic gnawed at the edges of my mind, and I reached for the radio again, desperate for a distraction. Static crackled through the speakers, but this time there was something else. A faint voice, distorted and fragmented, whispering words I couldn't quite make out. I slammed the radio off, my chest tightening as fear gripped me. The road ahead seemed to blur, the shadows along the edges twisting and writhing as if alive. My mind raced with questions. Who was that figure? What did they want? Was I imagining all of this? A sharp knock on the passenger side window made me swerve violently, the truck skidding across the asphalt. My heart leapt into my throat as I glanced at the window. For a split second, I thought I saw a pale face staring back at me. Hollow eyes, an expressionless mouth, and skin that seemed to shimmer in the faint light of the dashboard. I slammed my foot on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. The world outside fell silent again, save for the faint hum of the engine. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scanned my surroundings. There was no one there. My instincts screamed at me to get out of the truck and check, but my legs felt like lead. I couldn't bring myself to move, paralyzed by the fear that if I opened the door, I wouldn't be alone. Instead, I locked the doors and threw the truck into gear, my only thought being to get as far away as possible. As the truck accelerated, the darkness around me seemed to close in. The headlights barely illuminated the road anymore, and the shadows on either side appeared to stretch and reach for the truck. I tried to focus on the road, to convince myself it was all in my head, but my grip on reality was slipping. Then, the voice came back. It wasn't through the radio this time. It was inside the cab, a low, guttural whisper that sent chills down my spine. "You can't escape." I whipped my head around, but there was no one in the truck. My pulse thundered in my ears as the voice continued, growing louder and more insistent. "You've seen too much. You can't leave." The headlights flickered, and for a moment, the road ahead disappeared. When the lights came back on, the figure was there again, standing in the middle of the road, unmoving, staring directly at me. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The truck barreled forward, and I braced for impact. But as the vehicle passed through the figure, it vanished into thin air. A bone-chilling cold filled the cab, and my vision blurred as the truck swerved uncontrollably. When I finally managed to stop, the truck sat idling on the side of the road, the silence around me deafening. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white, unable to move or even breathe. My mind raced with thoughts of turning back, of abandoning the trip altogether. And that's when I noticed the figure again, in the rear-view mirror, sitting in the passenger seat. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I forced myself to look again in the rear-view mirror. The figure was still there, sitting motionless in the passenger seat. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but the glint of hollow, reflective eyes sent a chill through my entire body. "You can't be real," I whispered to myself, hoping the words would somehow banish the figure. But it didn't move, didn't respond, just sat there, its presence heavy and suffocating. Summoning every ounce of courage, I turned my head slowly to face the seat beside me. Empty. I blinked, my heart pounding in confusion. Had I imagined it? Was my exhaustion playing tricks on me? My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I stared at the empty seat, trying to make sense of what had just happened. A sudden noise snapped me out of my thoughts, a low creak, like the sound of a door slowly opening. My gaze shot to the passenger door. It was slightly ajar, the latch barely holding it closed. My pulse raced as I reached over to pull it shut, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. Just as I secured the door, the truck's engine sputtered and died, plunging me into an oppressive silence. The darkness outside seemed to press against the windows, and the faint glow of the dashboard offered little comfort. I tried to restart the engine, but it refused to turn over. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind as I fumbled with the keys, muttering desperate pleas under my breath. Then I felt it, a presence. It was as though the air in the cab had shifted, growing colder and heavier. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I knew without a doubt that I wasn't alone. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to not acknowledge whatever was behind me. But curiosity, or perhaps fear, got the better of me. Slowly, I turned my head, my movements stiff and deliberate. There it was, sitting in the sleeper compartment of the cab. The figure was barely visible in the dim light, but its eyes glowed faintly, piercing through the darkness. It tilted its head slightly, as if observing me, and a low, guttural sound filled the air. It wasn't quite a growl, but something far more menacing, an unearthly noise that sent shivers down my spine. "Get out," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Leave me alone." The figure didn't move. It simply stared, its presence suffocating. I reached for the door handle, my only thought being to escape, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was as if the door was sealed shut, trapping me inside with this thing. Desperation took over. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel, shouting, "What do you want from me?" My voice echoed in the confined space, but the figure remained silent. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The air in the cab lightened, and the oppressive cold lifted. I gasped for breath, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. My mind raced with questions. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my grip on reality? The engine roared to life without warning, startling me. I didn't question it. I threw the truck into gear and slammed on the gas, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever that thing was. The road stretched ahead, dark and desolate, but I didn't care. All that mattered was escaping. As the truck sped down the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow along the roadside seemed to shift and move, and every sound felt like a whisper in the darkness. My grip on the wheel tightened as I pushed the truck faster, the speedometer climbing higher and higher. When I finally reached the familiar glow of a truck stop, I pulled in and parked, my hands still trembling. The bright lights of the station felt like a sanctuary, a refuge from the darkness that had nearly consumed me. But even as I sat there, surrounded by the warmth and light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I didn't sleep that night. The memories of those glowing eyes and the suffocating presence haunted me, replaying in my mind like a broken record. And as I sat there, staring out at the shadows beyond the truck stop, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. The figure wasn't gone. It never would be. The following morning, I sat at the truck stop diner nursing a cup of black coffee. The bright, fluorescent lights did little to ease the lingering chill in my chest. Every clink of dishes and murmur of conversation around me seemed distant, muffled. My mind replayed the events of the previous night over and over, each detail sharper and more haunting than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me. The oppressive weight I had felt in the truck seemed to have followed me, invisible but present, lingering just out of sight. I glanced at the other truckers seated around the diner, wondering if they noticed my unease. But if they did, no one said anything. As I stared blankly into my coffee, a familiar voice called out, "Hey, Mike, you look like you've seen a ghost." I looked up to see Tony, a fellow trucker I'd known for years. His cheerful demeanor was a welcome contrast to the dark thoughts swirling in my mind. I forced a weak smile as he slid into the booth across from me. You could say that, I muttered, my voice hoarse. Tony frowned, his jovial expression fading. You all right, man? You look like hell. I hesitated, debating whether to tell him what had happened. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a horror movie, but the memory of those glowing eyes and the oppressive presence was too vivid, too real to ignore. Finally, I decided to tell him everything, sparing no detail. Tony listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each word. When I finished, he leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowing. "Damn," he said after a long pause. "You saw it." "Saw what?" I asked, my voice trembling. He glanced around the diner, lowering his voice as if afraid someone might overhear. "They call it the shadow hitcher. It's some kind of entity. A lot of guys on the road have seen it, but no one really knows what it is or why it appears. Some say it's a warning, others think it's something worse." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "You mean to tell me this thing's real? That it's happened to other people?" Tony nodded grimly. "Yeah, I've heard stories. Guys who've seen it don't usually like to talk about it, but there's a pattern. It shows up when you're alone, on a stretch of road with no one around. It gets in your head, makes you question what's real and what's not. And once you've seen it," he trailed off, his eyes darkening, "it doesn't leave you." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I leaned back in the booth, my hands trembling. "So what do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "How do I get rid of it?" Tony shook his head slowly. "You don't. You just live with it. Most guys say it fades after a while, but the fear? That sticks with you." I stared at him, my heart sinking. The idea of living with that presence, knowing it could return at any moment, was almost too much to bear. I finished my coffee in silence, my thoughts racing. "Look," Tony said, breaking the silence. "The best thing you can do is keep your head straight. Don't let it get to you. Whatever it is, it feeds on fear. If you give in, it wins." I nodded, though his words offered little comfort. The thought of returning to the road, of facing that thing again, made my stomach churn. But I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. This was my life, my job, and I had to keep going. As Tony got up to leave, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Mike. And if you ever see it again, don't stop. Just keep driving." I nodded again, watching as he walked away. His words echoed in my mind, a mixture of warning and encouragement. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I'd be fine, a part of me knew the truth. The shadow hitcher wasn't done with me. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.